The first reaction that is coming in from the government on the reported fraud at Punjab National Bank PNB, a $1.77 billion fraud via transaction as 30% of the bank's market capitalization. Let me go across to Neha Bothra for this story. Neha, we've heard what the government has had to say, that the necessary steps will be taken in this fraud, which is related to transactions. What exactly is it that we know when it comes to the PNB fraud? And when was this that it took place?
It's indeed a worrisome Wednesday for Punjab National Bank stakeholders. A double whammy. On one hand, you have the new NPA rules, and now you have this disclosure of a fraudulent transaction worth about 11,400 crore that has come to light. Clearly, it's battered the stock in trade today. More importantly, there are lots of questions that are unanswered. One is, when did the transactions take place, and what was the time gap between the transaction taking place and it being reported? Because clearly 11,400 crore is a pretty large sum of amount, and I've been speaking with insiders of the bank who are not sure if this panned out over a couple of months or if it was something that was one big transaction. And more importantly, I'd like to draw your attention to an important point in the disclosure, which says that this transaction also influenced other banks to extend money to the concerned parties overseas. So this raises a big question if there are more banks involved, and what really is the total amount of fraud we are talking about. These are all important questions that show gaping holes as far as the entire corporate governance in the bank is concerned, because as per the laws, once such a transaction takes place, it has to be alerted, the system has to be alerted, but clearly there have been lapses which have contributed to this scale of fraud at Punjab National Bank. We still await more clarity, but of course the matter has been referred to investigative agencies who are now looking into the matter. But there are lots of unanswered questions, and these are the questions that Punjab National Bank will have to answer sooner than later.
Oh, yes, we'll await those comments from the management, of course. As of now, big question marks remain. Thanks very much, Neha, for filling us in with those details. Let's bring on board Hemendra Hazari as well. And Hemendra, how are you looking at, a development like this? We're seeing a massive sell-off, of course, in the stock price of a Punjab National Bank, but we're talking about a fraud to the tune of 11,000 odd crore rupees, nearly 30% of PNB's market cap.
No, it is a very alarming and shocking figure. And, it really speaks very poorly for PNB that it could have such a thing happen in its bank. Now, this is an aspect which most media and analysts really don't look at, which are the off-balance sheet items of banks. And in this, I must also point out that you will find that the new private sector banks have a much higher off-balance sheet items as the size of their balance sheet compared to PSU banks. And I just hope that, you do not have similar things exploding in other banks, both in the government sector as well as among some of these new private sector banks. So I think this one should be extremely careful, because there is not adequate disclosure on really off-balance sheet items. And that is where, there is a huge potential for fraud, for evergreening. And this is something which analysts must start now, quizzing the senior management of banks. So what exactly is happening in the off-balance sheet space?
Right. Hemendra, when you get such announcement, maybe the financial impact is limited, or, what happens. But then it always brings up the possibility of more such happenings coming in, even in other banks. And that's why you're seeing PSU index down. And plus, then you had the RBI norms also being changed. So all of that coming together?
Yeah, I think a perfect storm is brewing for the banking sector. And the government banks appear to be in the eye of the storm. Because even this RBI norms, although on paper it sounds very nice that you're going to get a cleanup, it will entail really huge provisions and therefore huge losses for the banks which have a lot of this type of bad debts. And these principally will be with the government banks. One thing must also realize is that when fraud is detected in new private sector banks, they're very rarely reported. While in PSU banks, because of their systems, they have to report it, they have to file FIRs. In many cases, and these are something which I'm also currently investigating, in private sector banks, particularly new private sector banks, the frauds are all quietly hushed up, and the concerned individual is quietly made to resign and with a hefty payoff. They will very rarely you will find new private sector banks filing FIRs or issuing a press release when there is fraud. There is fraud which even takes place there. But in the public sector, they are mandated that they have to make it public and they have to file an FR, which is a very healthy, transparent practice. And though it has to be condemned, the internal systems in PNB has to be condemned. Investors and the public should realize that all these things also happen in new private sector banks, but it's all very quietly hushed up.
Right, Hemendra. Thank you so much for your perspective. Look forward to seeing more once we get this developing story and more details about what has happened to this 11,000 crores.